Hello and welcome to this. This is the third in our series of talks from Grace Church, Sheffield. And our theme is the Jesus kind of Christmas. And we're basing these talks around the first chapter in John's Gospel. Well, one Christmas when our children were young, my son, who was about 6 years old at the time, decided he would like a model fort or a model castle for that particular Christmas. Well, we were first in the ministry at the time and on a very low salary, and therefore money was very scarce, and we looked at the prices of all the model castles, all the forts that were available, and they were all pretty expensive, at least to us in those days. But I didn't want to disappoint my son, so I decided to make him one myself. Now, bear in mind that I'm a pretty impractical person. You know, I'm the kind of guy when he buys a set of nails, I have to get the sort which say hit this end. I did woodwork at school for a year and got 9% in the exam. The only time I've managed to get less than 10%. But I managed, this particular time I had a thought and I went to a craft shop and got hold of it was a hobby's plan. And using an old fretwork set I'd been given as a boy and I'd still got for some reason, I managed to cut the pieces of this plan out of hardboard and glue them together. And it took quite a bit of time, but guess what? By the grace of God and the sweat of my brow, I managed to make the said model castle, complete with dungeon, it all folds up and whatever. And you can bet my little boy was quite delighted when I presented it to him at Christmas. And not only has my son played with it, but other generations of children have played with it too. And it's still being played with by my grandchildren and their friends. Yes, it's lasted all that time, nearly 40 years. And it's also quite scary to think of how many Christmases have gone by since I made it, as my son is now in his mid-40s. And it's still on top of the wardrobe in our house. And every time I look at it, I think, gosh, I actually made that. How on earth did I do it? And it's quite amazing what you can do when you set your mind to it. Well, what's this got to do with John chapter 1, you might ask? Well, just as making the model castle for my son was not a random thought with no purpose, it was made for my boy with love and with a purpose and with a plan. So John chapter 1 tells us that we are not a random thought in the universe, but we have a loving Creator who made us with a plan and with a purpose. John chapter 1 says, through him, in other words, through Jesus, the Word, all things were made, and without him, nothing was made that was made. Now, I must confess that even before I became a Christian, I'd always found atheism a trifle illogical, because it's the belief that nothing made something, if you boil it down. And G.K. Chesterton once said, he said, atheism is indeed the most daring of all dogmas, because it's the assertion of a universal negative. And the more I've studied science, the more I'm convinced that because of the sheer complexity of the universe, that there is a cosmic designer. It couldn't have happened just by accident. Of course, this is what caused the great pioneering scientists like Isaac Newton and Kepler and others to study the universe, because they believed there was a rational mind behind the creation, and therefore the creation could be studied rationally. In fact, Kepler himself once said, as scientists, we are merely thinking God's thoughts after him. A top modern scientist, James Tour, said, I build molecules for a living. I can't believe to tell you how difficult that job is. He said, I stand in awe of God because of what he has done through his creation. My faith has been increased through my research. Only a rookie who knows nothing about science would say that science takes away from faith. If you really study science, it will bring you closer to God. Well, that's the opinion of a top scientist. I was reading the other day of an astronomer who said that studying the Bible furthered his desire to study science, and the other way round. And that is, of course, just echoing the great Isaac Newton, one of the fathers of modern science, who said that if we want to know how the planets revolve, we study physics. But if we want to know why they are there and why they revolve as they do, the purpose behind it, we look at the Bible. In fact, Isaac Newton apparently spent more time studying the Bible and theology than he did studying science. Of course, it's possible to believe in God as just a first cause, but then just believe if God exists, well, he's like an absentee landlord who's just cleared off and left us to run things ourselves because he's not interested in things on planet Earth. And many people believe that today. Well, if God exists, well, he's not really interested in us, and we may as well get on with our lives. And it's a philosophy called Epicureanism, and it goes back to the ancient Greeks. But the Bible sees things quite differently. God is our Father, and he's made us to interact with us. And it would be a terrible thing for us if our children, if we had them, and then if we cleared off, never to see them again. But you see, God is like that. He's our Father, and he wants a relationship with us. And even in the Old Testament, we see this in a man like King David. In Psalm 139, he marvels at the fact that he is fearfully and wonderfully made. He says, "Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvellous. How well I know it." Perhaps if King David knew what we know now, that the human body is made up of trillions of cells, each of which is a complex factory producing protein, a miracle of microengineering, he might have said, well, your workmanship is even more marvellous than I ever imagined. He might have gone much further. But you see, David goes further in his psalm, and he says, not only God has made us, but he is with us all the time. He says, you go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand. And you see, that's God's purpose for each one of us, to be with us all the time and to place his blessing upon us so that we can live out our lives as totally fulfilled human beings, being exactly what our Creator intended. And that was the purpose of Jesus coming to earth as one of us that first Christmas, to make a way for that to happen. Jesus said once, he said, this is eternal life, that people know you, the one true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. We know God through knowing Jesus. Of course, some people do not want God in their lives. The atheist, the late Christopher Hitchens, said quite openly he didn't want such a God in his life. And of course, God gives us that choice. He doesn't force himself upon us. When I presented my son with the gift I had made, and every other gift I've ever given him, actually, I gave him the choice of whether to accept it or not. And that's the nature of a gift. And God gives us the choice as to whether we want to accept eternal life or not. Whether we want to accept his plan for our lives or not. But we find when we do, we find it's the best decision we have ever made.